wake up, go straight, like, do you need to do like some deep knee bends or like arm circles, little calisthenics, wake up. So I want you to all pay attention for Clara, because Clara Fernández-Vara is a postdoctoral researcher at the Singapore MIT Gambit Game Lab, which is not familiar as they're one of our sponsors. Her work concentrates on adventure games, as well as the integration of stories in simulated environments. She teaches courses on video game theory and game writing at MIT, and she's the creative director of the adventure games Rosemary, Simon, and Stranded in Singapore. Do you want to also talk about the yeah, she's also like putting together the Boston Festival of Indie Games, which...
One of the many people.
Yes.
One of 5, 6.
It's only Clara. No. So she's on the team that's putting together the Boston Festival of Indie Games that's going to be later this summer, also at MIT. But today she is going to be doing a presentation, so please welcome Clara.
Right. Thanks everybody for being here. I'm Spanish and it's siesta time, so I know it's hard, but I'll try to do my best to give you a way.
Clara, can you use the mic?
Oh, yes.
Karaoke time. Yeah, I'm not used to this. I teach, so I just project, but okay. So, yes, I'm Clara, and I'm going to talk about indexical storytelling, and I got the habit of quoting pop songs from a teacher of mine. As Courtney said, she just read my presentation. I work at Gambit, I'm here at MIT, so I'm kind of like at home. And I'm a games researcher, which means that I research games, I study games, but I also make them. Part of my work is very much making, writing theories and coming up with theories that help us understand games better and making better games. So I'm not only a game theorist and I just, inside my head, having fun. This is all about making my theories accessible and useful also for industry and also for development. So as Courtney said, I've worked in games with teams of students here at MIT, Rosemary, Stranded in Singapore, and Simon. I'll give you the URLs at the end. And as I said, what I'm interested in is narrative in games. I work in adventure games because they're story-driven, and I'm very interested in how we bring together gameplay and narrative. How does it, what does it feel like when we have a game that has a story, but we're playing it as we go? And that's not really easy to come across. Some people solve it by having cutscenes and then having a bit of gameplay and then having the cutscene be the reward. But I'm interested in bringing them both together. So I'm going to be talking about one of the hot topics on game design, and specifically narrative design, which is environmental storytelling. The use of spaces in order to construct stories. If you go to GDC or if you listen to the GDC talks or Gamma Sutra articles, there's always somebody talking about environmental storytelling and the use of space as a way to tell stories. This is a term that has been borrowed from theme park design. This is the Harry Potter theme park in Orlando. And what this theme park is doing is evoking all the stories of Harry Potter through the space, so that you're navigating it and you visit the different locations that remind you of events from the Harry Potter novels and the movies. So this has been very inspiring for game designers, so that whenever there's a talk about environmental storytelling, there's always a mention, it's obligatory, you cannot talk about environmental storytelling without mentioning Portal and or Bioshock. And yes, they are excellent examples of what environmental storytelling is. We are going around in the space, and the objects that are in the space are telling us a story, events that have happened before we got there. I'll give examples only from Portal this time around and for Bioshock. And yes, that is one thing that environmental storytelling is. If you go and look at these articles on environmental storytelling, you'll also realize that they end up being a laundry list of a lot of techniques, usually not very organized. And although I'm going to give you a lot of examples about how environmental storytelling works, There's also kind of like a lack of something more systematic, something that is more unified. Because environmental storytelling is a really big discipline. We can't use this space in many, many, many ways. And what I'm going to talk about is just a specific set of strategies of environmental storytelling. The one thing that I want to really highlight here is that when people from the industry talk about environmental storytelling, they talk about environmental storytelling as a way to avoid cutscenes, so that we don't have to wait until the cutscene ends to start playing. We can bring together a story, we can go around and we can explore the space at our own leisure and figure out the story. And if the player doesn't want to know anything about the story, they can just go straight ahead and just play. If they don't care about it, that's fine. We don't have to stop for the story. And I think that just thinking about environmental storytelling as a way to avoid cutscenes is a bit short-sighted. I think that we can have a bit more than that. I think that it's not only about not having cutscenes because they're costly, because we need voice acting, because we need motion capture or whatever. It's not only cutting costs, it's not only avoiding cutscenes. I think that there is a lot of expressive possibilities for environmental storytelling, and more importantly, ways to encourage narrative gameplay. Ways to encourage people to play games and also advance in the narrative. So we can construct these environments that are packed with opportunities for interaction. There's a lot of things that we can actually do in these environments. It's not only watching them, it's not only like, oh, this is what happened. These environments tell stories that are inviting us to experience a narrative. So what I mean by indexical storytelling, this is the short version, is the technique, or is the set of environmental storytelling techniques that apply to a specific way of telling stories in the environment. And this is the practice of using indexes in order to construct a story. And you'll say, index what? Index like a book index, or index like an economic index, or index like my index finger? Well, this is where I get with a bit of the academies, okay? I'm a theoretician too. I come from academic presentations. I'm a teacher, so this is the part where I explain to you the basic theory. But don't panic. This is basic. Semiotics is something that I learned in high school. Is like very, very basic, but bear with me just for a bit. We have to start by understanding what the sign is. And the sign is a physical representation of a concept that we interpret. I'm talking about the theories of Charles Peirce, who was a philosopher and semioticist who actually worked in Harvard many years ago. And there are three types of signs depending on the relationship between the object that represents and the idea. There's the icon, the symbol, and the index. This will be short, I promise. First, the icon means that the physical representation of the idea resembles in some way the idea that is being represented. So a photograph is a representation of the thing that is pictured in the photo. If you think of icons, for example, icons resemble the thing that they're representing in a very idealized way. So for example, the signs for going to the bathroom, man, woman, they're very idealized, but they're icons of what they're trying to represent. That is the icon. The symbol is the representation, and the idea, the relation between them is arbitrary. So that the relationship between both is established by culture, by social convention. If we speak English, the word for, we can have the image of a tree, and the word that represents it is tree. In Spanish is árbol. In French is arbre. These are all different representations of that idea. My favorite example of a symbol is the biohazard symbol, which also goes very well when you're talking about games, because it was designed to be completely arbitrary. It was designed so that it didn't resemble anything at all. And you could see this and say, okay, I should stay away from this because this is really dangerous, probably. And finally, the last type of symbol, which is the one that I'm concerned about today, is the index. And the way the person explains the index is that there is a physical relationship between the representation and what is represented. The example that he gives is road signs. The direction in which a road sign tells you where a city is, the direction is what we mean. It's not the city itself, it's telling you where the city is. Which is a bit esoteric. There are other examples of what an index is that are more, easier to understand. If we see smoke in a forest, this smoke is telling us that there is fire, so it signifies fire. You don't see the fire, you see the smoke. There is a physical relationship between both. Doctors, when they are examining you, they're looking for your illness, but they cannot see the illness, but they can see the symptoms. A cough, a rash, all those are signify a certain illness, right? We don't see the real thing, but we know that the illness is there. So all these are indexes. All these are representations that we interpret, that we read. And we have to read them actively. We have to make that connection. The last thing, and this is, you know that this is part of an academic presentation because there's a citation down here. This is Peirce's description of what an index is. Some indexes are more or less detailed directions for what the hearer is to do in order to place himself in direct experiential or other connection with the thing meant. When I found this quote, I thought that this was really useful for game design because a lot of what game designers do, we are telling players what to do. What is it that they can do? We are giving them indexes. We are trying to create an experience, and we are giving guidelines. We are giving them pointers to experience certain things, right? So the idea of the index as something that has a physical connection to what is meant, plus the idea of directions, of indications, are going to be really productive when it comes to narrative design. And that's the end of the academies, okay? Now I'll talk about games. This is as far as the jargon gets. So, how can we actually build these stories through indexes? Can we do this? The answer is yes. You have a whole story here. Can you see this image? It's not the best one to show. Can you see what's happened here? So it's like a bunny that was hopping very happily. And then there was actually a hawk, apparently, that snatched the bunny, and that was the end of the bunny and the beginning of the hawk's lunch. This is the story. And it's all told through leftovers, through traces. These are indexes that we read. This is part of a series of photographies. There were more indexes left around, like bits of fur and blood and feathers. That gives us a more detailed and gruesome version of the story. But here we have, with just one image, we have the whole story. Yes? So we can use this for games. The key is not thinking about storytelling as we are telling something. We are thinking about storytelling as constructing little bits that we're going to interpret. So that even though I'm going to be saying storytelling all throughout because we have this habit and that's the word that we're used to, it's not really storytelling, it's story building. Meaning that as game designers, we provide pieces that are going to build a story, and that the players are going to take those pieces and build stories themselves. At times it will be the stories that we want them to have, but at times it can be their own stories, and that's where the fun begins. So, let me show you, this is kind of the theory. This is not really new. These set of practices in environmental storytelling have been used quite often, but I've come up with a way to classify them to make them a bit more accessible. In the same way, when I was talking about story building, I was talking about the designer and the players. When we are using indexical storytelling in practice, we can apply it to two different realms. On the one hand is the history of the work. As designers, we build the world, we build those pieces for the story, but also we can give, as designers, pieces for the history of the player to be built. So I'm going to go through a lot of examples of each so that you understand how these work. First, we can, as designers, we can, what does that mean? Did I break anything?
What was that sound?
Okay, good. Excuse me just for a second. So we have the history of the world. What is the history of the world? We create a world where the player has to discover what's happened in it. It's typical detective work. This is Phoenix Wright, which some of you might be familiar with, which has some sections where what we have to find out is what's happened in this space. There's been a crime, we go to the crime scene, we gather evidence, we're going to use that evidence in court to build the story of what actually happened. It's the most obvious way of using indexical storytelling, not only to tell a story, but to encourage certain types of gameplay. It doesn't have to be genre fiction. We have things like the Myst series, for example, that are all based around having left traces and figuring out what the story of those spaces is by looking at the leftovers of the inhabitants of these spaces. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a detective, noir kind of story. Oops. Oh, okay, yes. I forgot that I had added this little thing. When we are designing the history of the world and we are encouraging detective work, when we are designing this kind of detective work as the game, these are some questions that we can ask ourselves when we're using indexical storytelling. Okay, so how does the indexical storytelling construct what's happened in the environment before? What are the traces that have been left? Those events have left traces. Those are the indexes. What are they? And how can the player read those traces to reconstruct the story? How much flexibility does the player have to reconstruct that story as well? So that's one extreme. The detective stories is one extreme example of we have to read the story as a detective. That is the game. There's also the interpretation of remains, and this is how environmental storytelling is usually understood in general. So the whole thing, environmental storytelling, is reduced to interpreting remains. That's what you do in Portal, that's what you do in things like Bioshock. In Portal, we go behind the scenes, and there's been a test subject that has left scribbles on the walls. This is where the famous cake is alive comes from, right? It comes from a method of environmental storytelling. They've left a trace. You can find walls where the person who was there was sticking the wall. You can count every day that they spent there is a tick in the wall, on the wall. This creates a story. This tells us that somebody has been there. But how does this actually create gameplay? What does this have to do with gameplay? It's not only about telling the story. And I'm borrowing this from a talk by Harvey Smith in GDC, who says that these remains let us create an identity. Are we like this guy who was here before us? Was this guy or girl? We're a girl too. Are we trapped? Are we going to die here? What happened to this person who was here before us? So it's a way to create identities, not only about interpreting their remains, but kind of situating what is my behavior in comparison to people who've been here before. And as an example, a very clear example of how that can happen, this is one of my favorite games that uses indexical storytelling in order to produce gameplay really, really clearly. This is Demon Souls. We have this in Demon's Souls, in the online version, this is an RPG that is stupidly hard and punishing, as some of you might know. And if you are online, although not anymore, the online version of...
They kept it up.
Oh, they kept it up? Yeah. Okay, good, because if not, I don't know how you would play this thing. If you die, you leave a blood stain on the floor for all the players. So when you go around the world, there's blood stains that remind you, look at all these people that died here before you. Look at this. If you step on the blood stain, you can see a ghost, and a ghost is an index of somebody who's been there and died, and you see the animation of the last few seconds of the life, and you see them, you know, like either running away or falling off. Like, that's very funny. It's like they go, we see the mistake that they made. At times, if we're standing on the same spot, we might actually die because we're within the range of the breath of a fiery dragon, and that might not be the best place to be. But this is, you know, the idea of ghosts as remains of somebody's behavior in the space. And then we read those ghosts as a warning for what not to do. It's a way to shape gameplay, to tell players what not to do or what to do, right? So yeah, this is a really good example of how to use indexical storytelling to create, to encourage certain behaviors. So when we are creating the indexical storytelling for a game, the questions that we can ask ourselves are, who has been in the space before the player? How does this player relate to these traces? You know, how can we relate to the people who've been here? This is how, game design-wise, this is how we're using indexical storytelling to shape players' identity. This, the third example of the history of the world is the use of signposts and tutorials, and this is kind of like a strange thing. Because signpost is what Paris was talking about when he was defining an index. Now we do have signposts in games that tell us what to do, right? Navigation, for example. But when I was thinking of signposts, the first thing that came to mind was actually in Mario 64, the beginning garden. At the beginning garden, you have the tutorial of the game is effectively a series of signposts in the space, right? And you go there and it tells you, okay, if you press this button, you can jump on this tree and you can climb up, and you press A or press C, or, you know, move up and whatever. I don't remember exactly. I can do the movements of Mario 64, but don't ask me to tell you how they actually work. And what is interesting is that tutorials are indications of what to do very clearly. It's very, very explicitly. But in case of like the Mario 64 game, the trick here is that we are pointing to the world of the player. We are telling the player what to do. Oh, here is the controller. We're talking about the controller. And we're kind of, even though I'm not a big immersion person, I kind of hate the idea that we're going to shock people if we remind them that they're not in fantasy land, they are in their own dark room alone. I still think that it's okay to point to the outside world, but how does this affect the story? How does pointing out to the outside world really help us advance the narrative? And I'm pointing at this as a challenge more than a solution or an example of what's been done. Because it's really, really difficult to provide these indications without really stepping out from the world for a minute. So when we're using signposts, one of the things that I'm suggesting is, you know, on the one hand, if there are signposts that are just for navigation, you know, that can be part of the narrative. But when they're in-game directions, when we're giving those points, you know, how are we integrating that in the game? You know, how does it point to the world of the player, and how are we referring to the world of the player? So that's as far as the designing the history of the world goes. When it comes to the history of the player and giving the player the possibility of leaving indexes in the world, of leaving traces in the world to construct narratives, the first thing that we have to take into account is that we need a world that is persistent. we have to allow the player to leave a trace. And that's not something that comes packaged with games. It's not something that we can take for granted. And my favorite example of this is the Castlevania series, the 2D Castlevanias. If you've played them, you know that you complete one screen, you go to the next one, and if you step back, well, most of the enemies that you killed before are back there. Nothing happened. You didn't leave a trace. It's like, oh my god, I have to go back, I have to kill them again. This initially was a technological constraint. Not having enough memory, not being able to do that save state from screen to screen. It's become a design choice. We have better platforms now, but if you play any of the Castlevania DS games, they still do this thing. It's not that it's bad, but it's not persistent. It's not something that we can use to let the player leave traces. We have to allow the player to leave traces. And it's not necessarily a challenge of the technology, and I'm just really happy that we have a bunch of interactive fiction people in the room, because interactive fiction has been doing this since its origins. This is adventure, also known as Colossal Cave Adventure. And sorry to the interactive fiction fan who's seen this example 1,000 times, we all know this. There is the maze, one of the mazes in adventure. Whenever you enter the room, the description is always the same. You are in a maze of twisted little passages. Caves lead left, forward, right, back. You choose a direction, the description is exactly the same. You are in a maze of twisted little passages. So you feel lost. You're like, how do I navigate this? There's no difference between one room and the other. What can I do? The solution, and this comes back from the 70s, the mid-70s when this game was developed, was actually using the items in your inventory to leave a trace. You leave objects like a breadcrumb path, so that in here, for example, we see how at the end the player has left a zither, and when we enter the room, we see the same description as every other room, plus there is something else. Now we have a point of reference that allows us to map the space. So this is a very, very basic way of leaving a trace and helping us with gameplay. The player can tell its own story where he or she has been by leaving items in the space. Demosolves again uses indexes from players also to really, really useful. In the case of the blood stains, it was not voluntary, you just died. Here we have players are allowed to leave messages for other players. Again, this is in the online component. That are indications. Here we have there's valuable treasure ahead. Other times it can tell you, beware of the next room. There is a trap. You can give indications. These indications can be valued by other players. They can tell you, you can rate it if the indication is false or if it was actually leading you into a trap. Other players can say, like, no, this is not the right thing. But if it's helpful, people can give you positive points. So it's actually affecting your karma. So we have a mechanic which is leaving traces, the indications for the players that in the end can also revert to our gameplay. And last in this set of examples is actually the stealth genre. It's all about indexes. If we talk about indexes in gameplay, stealth games are all about not leaving indexes or leaving indexes in deceiving ways. So when we are in this is Metal Gear Solid 2, but if you're thinking of things like Thief, for example, or Kenchu, or the Splinter Cell games, we want to go undetected. Our footsteps, our indexes that were there. In Metal Gear, if you knock out somebody and their body's there, another guard sees them, they realize there's somebody here. Where is he? And they start looking for him. it's an index that you left behind. So you have to hide the body of the guard so that they don't realize that you're there. You can also use indexes in order to deceive people. So you can get an empty clip from your gun and you can throw it. It will make a noise. That is an indication, a deceitful indication for the guards who will go and try to find where you are. And then you can go past undetected. It's a way of tricking the guards. So the stealth genre, again, this is all about, all the gameplay is based around indexes. It's all about what types of indexes are you going to leave behind and which ones are you trying to hide. So when we are allowing the player to leave a trace on the space to build their own stories, to create narrative opportunities, we have to think about what are the mechanics that we have for the player to leave traces. Are there any way for the player to leave a trace? Again, it has to be a persistent world in order to do that. Who can read those traces? Are there going to be other players? Is this going to be a social component to it? Is it going to be other NPCs that we have to program or we have to teach which traces to look for? And how does leaving traces create these opportunities for gameplay? Is it a matter of hiding? Is it a matter of rewarding somebody for leaving those traces, or penalizing them if they leave those traces? So these are some strategies, things that we can ask ourselves in order to encourage players to actually use indexical storytelling themselves. So this is kind of like the main body of examples, but I don't want to. I want to finish this batch by making clear that even though most of these examples are AAA games, it doesn't have to limit itself to having a lot of money and 3D models and whatnot. I mean, we saw Adventure, for example, but there's also some games that have actually thrived in using indexical storytelling. And it's funny because two of my favorite examples have been made by the same company, Tiger Style. This is Spider, the Secret of Bryce Manor. This is a game for iPhone, iPad. And who's played this game? Okay, a few people. So this is about indexical storytelling, both on the part of the designer creating the indexes and the player leaving the indexes too. So if we go through the manor, we see the photographs of the family, and we see, when I guess the parents of the house got married, the kids that they had, and we see the family history through the rooms, through the objects that they own, through their photographs that we can read. And at the end, if you finish the game, there's also, what's happened. The ending of the game is also an index. So we are reading the environment. Who's been there, but with this little spider that is jumping from place to place. Or we live in cobwebs wherever we jump. So that if you remember at the end of each level, the camera tracks back and shows you how you left a trace, how you've left your cobwebs behind. It's the history of your gameplay that is left a trace on the space. So you're kind of collaborating to the family history in a way. Another game by Tiger Style. This is Waking Mars, in which you are in Mars and you're kind of creating this ecology of plants that are cross-pollinating each other in order to create biomass or something like that. I really like this game. But what is interesting here is that when you plant a plant, it's kind of there, it kind of stays there. There are mechanisms to remove them in certain stages, but most of the time, once you have a plant that is growing, there it is. You don't change it. And when you make a mistake and you grow a plant in the wrong place, it's probably going to stay there. So that we can go back and forth, the world kind of like opens up. And as you go back, you can see where you planted your little weird Mars plants and what you've done before. So these are the mechanics of both these games are all about letting the player leave traces and let those traces create a story. And because I don't work in the industry, I can show you the game that I'm working on with a team of students right now in Gambit. Doesn't have a title yet. We have one, but I don't know. I won't jinx it. It's a hypnotic game. One thing that really bothers me about hypnotic games is that they have very lush environments with a lot of objects, and they just throw rubbish on the screen. It's just like photoshopping crap, and it's like, find the crap that I just photoshopped in. And there's something inherently fun about that, but they are not using environmental storytelling. They're not using the opportunity to actually let the player figure out or try to figure out what's happened in that environment. So the challenge that we're facing here is creating a space where every object is there for a reason. It's left a trace. And it's funny because my artists are really struggling. They're not so used to having to think about the story of each little object on the screen. They just throw in stuff, and this is hard for them because it's not a habit, but it's not hard to really do. So what we're trying to do in this game is letting the players try to reconstruct the story through the objects that they're going to find in the hypnotic game. So that's, in 4 weeks, I'll tell you how successful that is. Or you can play it yourselves. It will be online. So this is a bit of the summary of the things that I want you to think about when we're talking about indexical storytelling. First of all, that indexical storytelling is a set of strategies for environmental storytelling. I think that I'm going to come up with a series of environmental storytelling strategies. This is just one set, and as we saw, it's a very rich set. The idea is that we are leaving traces and indications to construct a story. It can be both on the side of the designer, when we're designing the world, but it can also be on the side of the player. How is the player leaving traces on the space? And the thing is that we should not think about environmental storytelling, and specifically indexical storytelling, just as a way to save in cutscenes. This is a way to create interaction opportunities. This is a way to create opportunities for fun, and that's what games are all about. All right, thank you for listening.
We are not to take questions, but if anybody has questions, we can talk.
Exactly.
Yes.
So we're going to take a quick break, and then we're back on schedule. So 3 o'clock, we can meet back here, and Holly's going to get her talk on game audio.
That's